Gigantic sized superhumans walked the earth in the previous eras. Ancient Hindu temples lend evidence. It is not possible to correctly date the ancient temples of Bharat. They could well be hundreds of thousands of years older than their proclaimed antiquity, since no technology exists which could effectively estimate the time of construction of ancient structures built with natural rocks and stones. Amongst many others, Kailasa temple Ellora and Bojraj temple near Bhopal also bear the testimony of superhuman physical strength and sizes of human beings, such as the Pandavas who walked the earth in the previous Yuga. We briefly present the same in this video. There is no firm information about the vintage of ancient temples of Bharat, but we can't simply make this bald statement since no one would believe us unless we discuss all the prominent dating techniques available in the science of the day. And for this precise reason, we would briefly discuss them all. Hello friends, this is ex-Major Manish Bhatnagar. Welcome to the video number 4 of the Science Beyond channel. In the previous video number 1, we had witnessed glimpses of the theory of cosmic reflections, arrival of reflected hydrogen atoms from the moon towards the earth. In video number 2, we were introduced to the potent working of the cosmic perturbations. In the third video, we had brought out how NASA was wrong in proclaiming eclipse events harmless for human beings, much contrary to the reality. In this video number 4, we would discuss how not a single technique could effectively estimate the antiquity of ancient temples and structures of Bharat, which could in reality be tens of thousands of years old. The most talked about carbon-14 dating technique could date any sample which was once alive, such as wood or fossilized organisms. The technique works on the principle of measuring the decayed quantity of carbon-14, accumulation of which ceases with the death of any organism. However, this technique just couldn't effectively date the inorganic samples. Trapped charge dating technique estimates the vintage of samples of corals of certain types or organic parts such as tooth, etc. from the measurements of the electrons captured by them from cosmic or other solar radiations. This technique could date samples from as old as few thousand years to about 500,000 years. Potassium argon dating technique estimates the vintage of a given sample on the basis of measurements of the quantity of potassium 40 converted to argon 40. It is workable in the case of samples in which timing of rock formation from molten matter or of the water submerged sample coming out of water is to be ascertained, and practically nothing beyond this. It works well for samples older than 500,000 years. Uranium series dating technique works on the similar rationale in case of samples with radioactive substances. With its limited scope, this technique works for samples with vintage 40,000 to 500,000 years, that is a time period too remote for radiocarbon dating and too short for potassium argon. These techniques primarily estimate sample vintage by measuring radio decay quantities. Much contrary to these, electronic spin resonance or ESR estimates vintage of point of formation of any inorganic sample or time of birth of organic on the basis of comparative quantity of sample accumulated or trapped electrons as compared to the usual environmental supply quantity. This technique is more effective on organic samples and could estimate the vintage of teeth, etc. up to about 1,000,000 years, though with much scope for errors. None of these techniques could, however, estimate the vintage of ancient temples or structures. We are still left with two more dating techniques which would further test the veracity of this deduction. We would now mention thermoluminescence. Quartz rocks or stones made of silicates continuously capture electrons from the environment. Whenever any instrument or weapon made out of these rocks is heated for one last time for fixing its final shape, it releases all the prior captured electrons. Once the object cools down, it again starts trapping electrons. By measurements of these, thermoluminescence technique estimates the last time any sample of tools, weapon or ceramics was put through fire, like a clock reset. But this technique could also give us no idea about the vintage of ancient temples made out of rocks and stones. There is one last technique which works on the similar logic. Optically stimulated luminescence estimates the last time any sample was exposed to sunlight. This is the only technique from today's absolute dating perspective which could probably give an estimate about when a stone was fixed inside an ancient structure, provided still that the temple never underwent reconstruction, nor the inner walls of the temple were ever exposed to sunlight or exposure to strong light flash, laser, etc., or even reflected light at any time. A prerequisite highly unlikely to be satisfied in the sunny land Bharat with ancient temples designed to lit up even the inner areas with natural light. Practically, there is no absolute dating technique which could really work on ancient rock or stone-made structures. Then, on what basis have the ancient temples of Bharat, mostly made out of stones and rocks, could ever be attributed any vintage by Western science technologies? It is also well known that ancient structures and temples have undergone many cycles of destruction and reconstruction, in part or substantially, mostly due to invaders' destructive bent of mind. So far, most of the temples have thus been given a vintage on the basis of piecemeal investigations. By default or by design, Sri Kedarnath temple has been assigned a vintage of 800 to 1200 AD, Sri Somnath 900 AD, Sri Mahakal 600 AD, Sri Rameshwaram 1200 AD, Sri Kashi Vishwanath undated, Sri Dwarkadhish 2000 to 220 BCE, Sri Jagannath Puri 1000 AD, Sri Badrinath 1700 to 500 BCE, Sri Meenakshi Temple 7th century, Sri Kanchipuram 300 BCE. Even more interesting is the stated timeline of Sri Kailasa Temple Ellora. Primarily on the basis of two epitaph stones, it has been estimated to have been constructed around 8th century AD. Though most ancient temples have been constructed at a grand scale, yet the grandeur of Sri Kailasa Temple is unsurpassable. Its architecture, scale and type of construction indisputably point that it has been constructed with some unique technique which was definitely not in use in the AD era, let alone the 8th century. Also, if it was in use in the 8th century, where did it suddenly disappear after construction of such a massive and intricate structure such as the Kailasa temple? It is possible though that the caves etc. and some other minor type of construction might just have been taken place around 8th century AD, which gave the archaeologist an excuse to date the entire ancient structure to 8th century AD antiquity, much contrary to the empirical realities projecting out of its unsurpassable grandeur. The story of Bhojpur temple near Bhopal, which is much smaller in size, scale and complexities, is no different from that of the Sri Kailasa temple. This incomplete and roof open structure is originally stated to have been built by the Pandavas in just one night and work abandoned at the dawn. Though, however, Archaeological Survey of India terms the same as an untrustworthy folklore and instead gives its own position on its timeline as that belonging to the 11th century AD by Raja Bojraj of Dhar. There is semblance and remains still exists of an erstwhile work site close to the temple which contains detailed drawings and unutilized construction material. A Jain temple located nearby and stated to be co-temporous of this temple bears craftsman marks and timeline of 1035 AD. ASI asserts Bhojpur temple to be of 11th century even according to the carbon dating. But how could the said dating belong to the original structure which is fully made up of rocks and stones and totally devoid of any organic material which could really be carbon dated? It is probable though that they have dated suitable attachment made up of wood etc. which would well have been added to the original structure in later era. We move forward with ASI data nevertheless. During the years 2006-2007, the Bhojpur Shiv temple was put through repair work under Sri K.K. Mohammed, a renowned archaeologist. The repairs also included resurrection of a 12-ton heavy pillar which had become necessary due to the damage to one of the original pillars. The bizarre fact was that the resembling stones out of which the original structure was made could nowhere be found nearby and finally had to be brought all the way from Agra. Sri Muhammad also found that two pillars of the original temple structure, which were monolithic or single piece, weighed nearly 33 tons. The original structure was without joints. A relook at the fate of the temples constructed during the times of King Bojraj is not out of place. Bhoj had got 104 temples constructed in his own capital city Dhar. Unlike the robust Bhojpur temple, none of them survived. Also, none of them were even a minuscule of the grandeur as that of the Bhojpur temple. A few lines of the history chapters are the only weak link between Bojraj and Bhojpur Shiv temple. A book titled Prabandh Chintamani, scripted by a Jain writer, Merutung, states Bojraj, mentioning his plans of constructing Bhojswamin temple to a poet Magha. But Magha was a poet of 7th century and Bojraj a benevolent, kind and popular king of the 11th century. This also proves that Bhojpur temple was not constructed by Bojraj, at least not its original structure, not even by any stretched rationale. I would now list all the reasons on the basis of which I state that ASI and the very talented and respected Sri K.K. Muhammad were highly mistaken when they declared Bhojpur Shiv temple to have been originally constructed by King Bojraj rather than the Pandavas themselves. A bare look at the temple reveals that basic and original structure of the temple is constructed with different set of rocks which could not be found nearby today or even in the 11th century. The walls of the temple are made up of different kinds of rocks which could be found in the vicinity. This not only proves the basic structure and the walls to have been constructed in totally different era of time, much apart, as also that makers of the two were obviously not the same lot. It is quite possible though that the nearby Jain temple and the cosmetic restructuring of the ancient Bhojpur Shiv temple was planned and executed by same set of persons in the 11th century. The original structure of the temple is almost without ornamental or cosmetic carvings etc. Those seen now were indisputably added much later by making slits and cuts in the original structure to make place for fixing them. The same would have needed ramps etc. for workmen to reach at the desired heights. Semblance to such a ramp is found near the temple. The Shivling is nearly 21.5 feet from the temple floor. The monolithic or single stone Shivling is 2.83 feet in diameter, mounted on a jalhari of 20 feet in length and width. The dimensions and type of structure suggests that the temple is not anything like a traditional temple. Rather, it seems to be a creation meant for worship in the wilderness during transit. With its originally open roof, the structure points to the same having been made by some superhumans in a very short time. The pillars, which could be weighing anything close to 70 tons, were hurriedly fixed and a gigantic shivling similarly erected for worship in transit, almost squarely in confirmation of the folklore about the temple having been constructed by the mighty and gigantic Pandavas during their period of forest dwelling and travels. It is stated that Bhima, the strongest of all the Pandavas, had strength equivalent of 10,000 elephants. The Bojraj temple is peculiar not only timeline-wise but also for throwing evidence of possible gigantic size of the human beings in the previous eras, much according to the Yuga scheme of the Sanatan system. Pandavas could well had been around 22 feet tall. The scientific possibilities of living beings having different size with change of gravitational arrangement stands scripted in detail in my book Cosmos and the Divinity Volume 1. The fact about basic structure of the temple having been constructed in one night also draws much credence from such physical size and strength of the Pandavas and from their being superhuman from present standards as well. The presence of rain, which could have dented the said deduction, abates when we realize that the same was constructed later in the 11th century AD for facilitating ornamental and decorative redo rather than the original construction of the temple by the present day physically sized workman. The structures attributed to be constructed by the Pandavas across Bharatvarsh are mostly constructed in rocks and stones with a specific technique involving superhuman strength and physical sizes, bereft of much carving or decorative themes. They are located in various parts of Bharat on the routes stated to be traversed by the Pandavas during their years of exile, which establishes their credibility as authentic rather than folklore. The story of most other ancient temples is no different, at least on the timeline, which could be hundreds of thousands of years older if estimated in terms of the rate of time passage of the present Yuga. Many of them constructed on a scale and size possible only with far more superior architecture and technology than in use presently. Grandeur and precision not possible even in repair or resurrection of these ancient marvels. It is also just not possible for any technique to precisely fix their antiquity. There is another peculiarity which helps fix their relative dating interstate. It is amazing to note that older temples have more complex, intricate architecture and grandeur than the later ones. The time seems to be working in reverse or cyclic manner with the superior technology in vogue during the remoter times than the recent ones that eventually got lost at some point of time in between. Hiding the fatal deficiencies and pitfalls of its absolute dating techniques, Western science is acting like a self-proclaimed master of scripting history far from the reality of it all. It can be discerned clearly that almost every ancient temple place of Bharat has a history that corresponds to the BC era, which however has been labeled myth or superstition by reducing their antiquity to AD era. If possible, please do remember that you first heard about the reality behind the Bhojpur Shiv temple, about its remoter antiquity then proclaimed, about its being made by the Pandavas, and about their superhuman physical size and strength on the Science Beyond or through my book Cosmos and the Divinity. Please do remember to like and share the video besides subscribing the channel. We would continue to bring new light on cosmic reality through our original research. Thank you.